Good afternoon, everyone. I know there's still folks saying hello to each other and grabbing a piece of pizza back there at the back, but I definitely do want to say good afternoon, and it really is great to see everyone. I know nobody is counting down the days until the end of classes and your reading period, but I'm really glad you made the time to come and join us here today for the 2024-25 William R. Stewart Memorial Lecture for Labor and Employment Law. Before we introduce today's wonderful speaker, Professor Matthew Bodie, I wanted to give a brief background on the Endowed Lecture and the man for whom it is named. The lecture was founded in 2007 in honor of the late Bill Stewart. Stewart earned a bachelor's degree in government from Indiana University in 1954 and started law school with a full scholarship that October. A year later, Stewart was called to active duty with the U.S. Army and served our country with great distinction. After 3 years of service and earning the rank of first lieutenant, Stewart returned to Bloomington and completed his JD, also with distinction, in 1959. After graduating, Stewart joined the National Labor Relations Board, where he worked for 34 years, eventually rising to become the board's first African-American chief counsel. His leadership and commitment to excellence prompted Bill Clinton to award him the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service and to characterize his contribution to the NLRB as unparalleled. At the time, he was the first and only NLRB employee in its entire 69-year history to receive this honor, the highest honor any civil servant can receive. Past Stewart lectures have been some of the most prominent labor and employment scholars in the nation. They include William Gould from Stanford University, Laura Cooper from the University of Minnesota, Martin Malin from Chicago-Kent College of Law, Sam Begunstos from Michigan Law, Cynthia Estlund from NYU, Susan Strum from Columbia, and last year's University of San Diego's Orly Lobel. This year, we're very pleased to continue this list of exceptional scholars and speakers with Professor Matt Bodie from the University of Minnesota Law School. At this point, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Associate Professor Alvin Velasquez, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. I am so excited to be introducing to you my friend and mentor, Matt Bodie. Matt Bodie is the Robbins Kaplan Professor of the University of Minnesota Law School. He has a really interesting intersection of topics that he covers, and he writes and teaches on labor law, corporate law, data privacy, and algorithmic management. Professor Bodie has published over 50 book chapters and articles in journals such as the Georgetown Law Journal, the Notre Dame Law Review, and Vanderbilt Law Review. He also has written a really great book called The Reconstructing the Corporation: From Shareholder Primacy to Shared Governance. For those of you taking corporate law, just a quick book plug. It's a great summary of corporate law as well as a summary of the great debates in corporate law. Really recommend it. He served as a reporter for the American Law Institute's Restatement of Employment Law in 2015, where he focused on employee privacy and autonomy. He and Professor Samuel S. Stryker of NYU are the authors of Labor Law for Foundation Press, and he has been interviewed several times by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and other publications on topics ranging from COVID-19, employer surveillance, as well as the Starbucks union drive. It meant he could say more about it than I could because I was obviously working on some of those campaigns. So before he earned his AB from Princeton University magna cum laude and a JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law, as well as an LLM in employment labor management from NYU's School of Law. He clerked on the Fourth Circuit with Judge Blaine Michael, and was also a field attorney for the National Labor Relations Board, handling cases involving the National Hockey League, Chinese Banquet Hall, and over 100 small construction companies. He's also a faculty editor for the ABA Journal of Labor and Employment Law. Obviously he has a great set of a great resume, but also on top of that, he's been very generous with his time and his energies, not just in terms of mentoring me, but also in pouring into students who are interested in labor and employment law at the University of Minnesota. And so for those of you students who are here, I would really take advantage of the fact that he's here to talk to him a little bit about how he came together, how he got interested in all these intersecting topics, because it's great to hear that there's people interested in labor law and how it connects with these areas of law that people don't typically think about. With all of that, I am so happy to introduce to you Matt Bodie.
So, wow, I'm really touched by that. Thank you so much to Dean Ochoa and Professor Velasquez, and it's been a wonderful opportunity to get to know Professor Velasquez and the amazing work he did before coming to the school, and I'm really excited for his future as an academic at this school, and more broadly in the labor and employment community. A lot of friends in the audience. I will just point out quickly, Professor Dal Schmidt and Professor Whitus, thank you so much for inviting me here. Since this is on Zoom, and since my talk is about identity, I'm also going to shout out my lovely wife, Rebecca Hollander-Blumoff, if you're out there. My kids, I think some of them might be watching. One's at Oxford right now. Woohoo! So, and then I think my sisters might, or one of my sisters might be watching. Maybe the other will catch it on YouTube. So my talk is about employment and identity, and really I'll kind of lay out the scope of the paper in a minute, but I just have this slide up here because another part of my identity, let me just see if this is, maybe turn this on. Oh, there we go. Well, hold on. I could do this maybe. Sorry, sorry. Oh, okay. Maybe it's the Zoom, in and out of Zoom. All right. Awesome. So, I joined the University of Minnesota in 2022. In 2002, I joined as a associate professor at Hofstra University, which were the Flying Dutchmen, but changed to the Lions when I was there. And then after that, I was at St. Louis University for a long time, which has the Billiken, a very notable mascot. Because no one really knows what a Billiken is. Although I think the Billiken won the slam dunk contest on the A10 Jimmy Fallon contest like 3 years ago. Anyway, that's Goldie the Gopher. And prior to 2022, right, this picture would not be really, I mean, it would be kind of a fun thing to do maybe if I happen to be stopping by, but it wouldn't be meaningful in terms of part of my identity, right? But now, I am a faculty member at the University of Minnesota. So when the University of Minnesota does well, it kind of, I'm happy, right? It doesn't really, I mean, people don't think like when the basketball team or the women's volleyball team does well that, it's me. I have like no real role in that, but it's kind of like, hey, this is something that reflects on me. So I will point out that according to my calculations, over 20% of the Stewart lectures have been given by University of Minnesota folks. Woohoo! So I will, again, I had no real role in that, but other than this last one, and maybe it'll stop after me, I hope not.
We've run out of people.
Yeah. Hey, we'll keep coming up with them, don't you worry. And also I wanted to say briefly about Bill Stewart. His legacy is amazing. I also, as Alvin mentioned, I was at the NLRB. I did not get any distinguished service awards from President Clinton or anyone else while I was there. And his record of service is really quite a testament to obviously himself, but to the school as well. And I'm humbled to be giving a lecture in his name. All right, so what will I be talking about? I'm going to be talking about employment and identity, and that's kind of one of these nice law professor broad titles. What does that exactly mean? Hopefully it piqued your curiosity, you're here. I'm going to be talking about identity in a couple of different ways. Personal identity, but then the conflict, the relationship with organizational identity. And how do those things meet? And employment is kind of a battleground to some extent, or a place where people can cooperate and work together. And identities, both personal and organizational, are created, fostered, developed through the employment relationship. And so I'm going to talk about conflicts between organizational and personal identity, but I'm also going to talk about the creation, construction, and conflicts within the organization, about the organization's identity itself, right? And what roles can employees play in the construction of this organizational identity that we have. All right, so there is a lot of psychology, organizational psychology, sociology work on identity. I am just giving a kind of a superficial law professor's perspective on it. I kind of mean it in the sense that we might talk about it colloquially, right? What is our identity, right? What does it mean to say I am Matt Bodie, right? It is a variety of, you could say it's an agglomeration of associations, relationships, characteristics, abilities, skills. And employment plays a big role in that, I think, right? For some people, it doesn't play that much of a role. For some people, perhaps the big thing, if you ask who are you, they will say what they do, right? They might say their profession, or they might say their profession at a particular organization, right? But who we work with and for reflects on us, right? And it's part of our identity, right? Organizational identity, kind of the same thing, but for an organization rather than a person, so it becomes obviously much more complicated because we no longer have a unitary physical form that kind of manages the identity. There's no real questions, right? Our identity might be affected by our relationships, right? And certainly my relationships with my family, my relationships with my colleagues, my relationships with my friends, all affect who I feel that I am. But I am ultimately in control. Organizationally, though, it's a little more complicated, right? But still, there are questions for organizations. Who are we as an organization, right? So just thinking along the lines, what does organizational identity mean, right? It might mean characteristics, right? The Thinkit case versus Sun Microsystems is a Section 1981 case where the corporation was suing for racial discrimination. And the court had to wrestle with the question, can a corporation have a racial identity? The Ninth Circuit said yes, right? This corporation is a minority-owned business, and it had been perceived as having a racial identity, and therefore, for purposes of the suit, they could sue under Section 1981 for discrimination based on race. Is there a purpose to the organization, right? For corporate law, we know that under most statutes, the corporation need only have any lawful business purpose, right? That's kind of where we've developed. That's not how it was in the early 1800s, but over time, we've kind of washed out purpose, but we've seen a resurgence of purpose with benefit corporations where states say, okay, you can create a benefit corporation, but you have to have a purpose. You have to have some sort of goal that you're moving towards. Finally, identity can also be related to governance, obviously, right? Who controls what the corporation does? Who controls who is CEO? Who controls who is populating the employment group? Who controls what the corporation owns and does, right? Shareholder franchise, traditionally for most business organizations in this country, corporations, is that structure. All right. So there's kind of two grounds of conflict that I'm going to be talking about. One, if I have a personal identity and it conflicts with the organization, or the organization perceives that my identity conflicts with the organization, right? How is that managed, right? Secondly, who has a say in what the organization's identity is? Who can contribute to that? Who can control that? And those are the two things I'm going to be talking about today. All right, so employment is traditionally defined under the common law as the right to control, right? And so this is kind of a longer version of that, right? But if you read it, and it's something labor and employment folks think about all the time, but just going back to it and reading the text, you're kind of struck by how it sounds, particularly in the restatement second of agency. A person employed to perform services in the affairs of another and who, with respect to the physical conduct and the performance of the services, is subject to the other's control or right to control. Right? How many people have seen Severance? How many people have gotten to the end of Severance? All right, most of the people, okay. Not too many people. All right, I'm not going to spoil anything. I'm going to try and talk about Severance without spoiling anything. My family did a mad dash to the end in the last few weeks. Right, it's a creepy show. It's a stressful show. But it's in some ways a workplace comedy, question mark, right? Particularly the first season. And you know, for those of you who don't know what the show's about, it's about this severance procedure. The Lumen Corporation has created the severance procedure whereby your work self is separate from your personal or home self, right? And there's a surgery that happens when you start, and they have a little thing that when you take the elevator down to your floor, you change, and suddenly you do not remember anything about your personal self. When you go to the work floor, you only remember your work self at Lumen, right? Now again, if you kind of press on that a little, we've had questions like, well, what exactly do they know? If you press on it, there's some questions. But the idea is it's a metaphor in some ways, right? For what happens when you go to work, right? You kind of become a different self on some level. And can you separate those things? And what will happen if you separate those things? And does capitalism want you to separate those things, right? That is kind of some of the bigger questions that the show is asking, right? But when we talk about control in that context, right, it's interesting because in theory the workers can leave at any point. I don't want to give too much away again. But you really feel the sense of control when they're there because they are completely, right, that's all they know and all they remember is this strange little cubicle, right? And then these mazes of winding halls and all sorts of other things. But this idea that we're going to create a separate identity just for work, and your employer will shape what you know and what you understand and what you want, right? And what you do, right? Moving little numbers into boxes, right? That's what a lot of the workers seem to be doing. And that is kind of scary. It's kind of creepy, right? So to what extent does our employer control our personal identity? To what extent can the employer kind of impose itself on our identity, right? Again, the right to control, right? What does that mean? Uniforms, right? Uniforms are something that show I am part of this organization, right? And we have professional uniforms too, right? I'm wearing a suit right now, right? That kind of indicate a certain level of gravitas and the importance of the occasion. That's not indicating my employer necessarily, but if I had a little Minnesota pin, perhaps that might indicate that, or a Minnesota tie. Speech, right? Can the employer control my speech? Yes, right? If I went into a contracts classroom and I started teaching civil procedure, just because I felt like teaching civil procedure that semester, my employer could yank me out of there and say, sorry, you have academic freedom, but you don't have the freedom to teach civil procedure when you're supposed to be teaching contracts, right? And this goes for government employees too, who actually do have a First Amendment right within the workplace. The Ceballos versus Garcetti decision. Reputation, right? Again, the employer's reputation reflects on me and vice versa. And data, right? This is a thing that has really changed recently. But the amount of data that our employers have about us, right? And you may have read about some of the Amazon workplace, just listening all the time to employees, monitoring every movement, right? Again, in the name of efficiency, going back to, Frederick Taylor in the late 1800s. But the idea here is that we are handing over a lot of data, right? Professional athletes, right? We think of professional athletes as pretty empowered in a lot of circumstances, but the amount of data they give to their employers, right? The amount of data that if you follow sports, right? You are following workplace data for these folks, right? And their employers are often monitoring how they sleep, right? You're not getting enough sleep. It's affecting your on-the-field performance, right? And some athletes want this, right? There's actually a group of kind of lower-level soccer or football, they would say, players in the UK, who are like, hey, we want more data about ourselves. We're not in a position to improve. We want our workplace, we want our employers to tell us more about how we're doing. We feel like we're being cheated by not being monitored all the time, right? This comes, particularly these new crises come at a time where there's a lot about the post-war economic compromise. I almost said neoliberal, but I'm like, that word is a little too charged, has a lot of different meanings. But we had this post-war compromise where like work was work and home was home, right? And they were split, right? That's the man in the gray flannel suit there. And that was seen as how we would manage things, right? And a lot of unions actually took this to heart too, right? And so if you were fired for something that happened at home, a lot of union arbitrators would say, no, that's outside the workplace. You have to be judged on your workplace performance, not on what's going on elsewhere, right? But there are eroding barriers here, right? Work from home, obviously, to the extent that many people are now doing that, right? Your home now becomes the place of your work, right? Your email, you might do some personal stuff on your email or on a tablet or on a phone that your employer provided you, right? You might be working online, right? Having a Zoom call with your home in the background, right? Employer monitoring, right? Monitoring might just be limited to the workplace or it might extend beyond that. Personal data, right? Is my movements, is that my personal data? Or if I'm at the workplace, is that the workers, the employer's data, right? Whose data is that, right? And then, of course, social media, right? Because social media is taking a lot of our personal lives and putting it out to everyone. Right now, again, we might manage that by having only our friends see it, right? But how many of our friends are also workplace friends, right? The law attempts to balance here, but you may think that it does a good job or a bad job, right? In terms of protecting personal and organizational identity, anti-discrimination provisions, right? Say you can't take identity into account to adversely affect the employment relationship, right? Not hire someone, fire someone, not give them a promotion, right? You can't take aspects of their identity into account. Certain anti-discrimination protections actually require an accommodation, right? Most notably the Americans with Disabilities Act and religious protections, right? Which we recently were read as de minimis accommodation requirements, but in the DeJoy case, the Supreme Court, Groff versus DeJoy, Supreme Court turned that into something that, an undue burden is more of an undue burden that the employer has to show. So that's the employer actually has to reach out and help accommodate the employee's specific identity-related issues or concerns or needs. Privacy protections, right? Again, I worked on a chapter in the Restatement of Employment Law on common law protections for privacy. I've written generally, 2022, the Indiana Law Journal published, Indiana Law Journal folks here, woohoo, yeah, woo, there we go, all right. Hopefully you'll publish this next one, but maybe you'll change your mind again. I'm knock on wood. But I'm really excited about that article if you hadn't had a chance to check it out. And I'm really excited to have published with the journal. But that was about how privacy isn't really working that well for employees. I'm actually more into property for employees and their data, but we can talk about that later. And then off-duty statutes. I don't know how many people know about these. They're mostly state statutes. But statutes that say, hey, off-duty activities of the employees cannot be taken into account unless they're really detrimental to the employer's, reputation or ability to do business, right? Now, the employer is not powerless to manage its own organizational identity or to infringe or keep out people whose identities they do not think match with their own employment at will, right? You can fire someone for any reason, right? So one of my sons is a redhead, right? Well, that might be a little complicated actually to say no redheads. And I certainly shouldn't say that because he feels a little under siege for being a redhead. I think it's great that he's a redhead. We call him the recessive child because he's a good athlete. He's got red hair. He can play an instrument, none of which I can do, nor my wife, just to throw her under the bus a little bit. But anyway, you can choose very arbitrary, irrational reasons to fire someone, and you can do that. Right now, again, you can't fire them for any of the protected classes under anti-discrimination law, right? But otherwise, you're kind of free. Like, I don't really think you're fitting in here. Sorry, you got to go. Right? Corporate structure, right? We'll talk a little bit about this more. But the structure of the corporation is set up to give a lot of power over who works for the corporation and who controls who speaks for the corporation, right? Most corporations have a hierarchical structure, and ultimately, the top of the hierarchy gets to control the organizational identity of the company. And intellectual property, right? The company can suck up a lot of identitarian power, right? Some of that is through data. Some of it's through trademark, which I'm going to be talking about a little later. All right, so just to give some quick examples of conflict, right? So, the Nazi white supremacist gas station attendant. There's a case from the early 2000s where someone was working at a gas station and was doing a good job there, but then word got out, I think through a newsletter, that he was at home, completely away from the premises, right, participating in literature. I think this might have been pre-web, but he was basically a white supremacist and was participating in that literature. And he was fired for that. And he said, that's unfair, that's outside of work, that's off-duty activities. And the court said, no, this affected the reputation of the employer. The employer was justified in firing him. The intoxicated doctor. And so a young doctor was fired because she got into an argument with her Uber driver when she was obviously intoxicated. Now, normally, this wouldn't be a big deal, right? But guess what? Someone was filming it, and someone posted it to the web. And within a day, she was fired from her job. I think it was at the University of Miami Hospital, because it reflected poorly on the hospital. The disgruntled mascot. The Pittsburgh Pirates haven't done great recently. I'm originally from Baltimore, so I'm still bitter about the 1979 World Series. But they haven't had a great run since then. And the mascot started posting on the employee who plays one of the mascots was posting on social media about how terrible the team was and how frustrated he was with management. He was fired, right? It's like, well, wait, this is what I'm posting on my own personal social media, right? But, that reflects poorly, right? Another example I could have used is the child care worker who posted on her Facebook page that she hates kids, right? She was fired, right? That was personal. It's just, I suck it up and I deal with those little monsters every day, right? But, and then the six strikers. So those who teach labor law might be familiar with this case. So there was a effort to organize, a group effort to organize and get paid sick leave at Jimmy John's. And I know this is small, so I'll read it out. There are two pictures of what appears to be the same sandwich. The one side says, your sandwich made by a healthy Jimmy John's worker. The other says, excuse me, your sandwich made by a sick Jimmy John's worker. And it said, can't tell the difference? That's too bad, because Jimmy John's workers don't get paid sick days. Shoot, we can't even call in sick. So they were fired. The NLRB said they were participating in collective concerted activity. You can't fire them for that, right? They were bringing a workplace complaint, namely that they didn't have sick leave, and they were bringing that to the attention of the community, right? The Eighth Circuit on appeal said, no. They're disloyal, right? And there's the Jefferson Standard case in the board, it's a Supreme Court case, says if you cross the line into disloyalty by disparaging the product itself, then you've crossed the line from protected concerted activity into unprotected activity, and you can be fired, right? So, board says this is protected. Eighth Circuit says it's not. All right. So I bring those up just as kind of like, to kind of make you think more about, okay, where is this line? Where has it been drawn? Where should it be drawn, right? I do think there are opportunities to further protect our identities, particularly when it comes to data. Name, image, and likeness, I think, is a hopeful possibility. The book that I have up there is The Right to Publicity by Jennifer Rothman. And we've seen name, image, and likeness has been pretty popular recently with college athletes, right? Because they're getting paid purely for their name, image, and likeness, which has nothing to do with their on-field performance. Maybe people are afraid of laughing at that. Woo, Big Ten. But a lot, yeah. So, and the question is, are college athletes employees, right? Or should they be employees? That's part of but their name, image, and likeness is seen as separate, right? And I think that's going to maybe be brought into the employment relationships more generally when we think about employee data being taken and used. Because in some ways it is a little bit like your identity, right? If you take enough data about you, you can start to feel like, wow, this organization, this employer, knows a little more about me than I'd like. And maybe they're using that in a certain way, right? And we've seen this come up with AI as well. I know last year's talk from Professor Lobel was about AI. This is really contested territory in two important strikes and subsequent collective bargaining agreements with the Writers Guild Association and with SAG-AFTRA, the Screen Actors Guild. So what was WGA worried about? They were worried about companies just saying, that script, yeah, those screenwriters aren't very good anyway. We'll just throw it to AI and say, all right, ChatGPT 8 or 4, I know we're only at 4, but thinking ahead. Give us a screenplay, about a professional woman who goes back to her small town during the holidays and meets a lumberjack and decides that she's going to give up her big city life and fall in love, right? This is basically every Hallmark holiday movie. Could that be done by AI? Maybe. I don't think it would be done as well, but I'm more of a skeptic, I guess. But the Writers Guild was really worried about corporate executives seeing the price difference between these two and saying, hey, we're just going to go to AI, right? So the Screen Actors Guild was worried about identity, right? The identity of the actor within the context of employment, right? They're working as, say, a particular character. Can the employer capture, like motion capture, the little, I don't know if they still do this, but the little dots all over you, right? You say, Circus, Andy Serkis, like the master of this. Can they capture you as the character and then, hey, if we have to do some reshoots, we want to add some scenes, maybe we don't need you to come. Maybe you're shooting a movie in New Zealand. We don't want you to have to come back from New Zealand. We'll just AI or, we'll just a CGI, I guess I should say, create your character and kind of put it into these scenes, right? And oh, by the way, we're going to do a sequel and we'll just use the CGI for the sequel. Don't worry about it, right? That's Screen Actors Guild was worried about that. And, again, put limitations on that. All right, so I think we often think about personal identity and employment as trying to protect our personal identity. But one thing I do want us to keep in mind, and this kind of transitions to my next point, which is that part of our identity is wrapped up in employment. And that can be positive, right? It's not just about protecting what we do at home. It's also, we spend a lot of time at work. We want to be doing that in a way that we feel is positive, adding to society, doing a good thing. We're good at our jobs, right? Being good at our jobs can be a really important part of personal identity, right? Which brings me to my next TV show that I referenced in the little teaser for this talk, The Bear. How many people have seen The Bear? Oh, a lot more have seen The Bear, okay. I think the show might be more stressful than Severance, which is not really, it shouldn't really be that way. But so The Bear, if you haven't watched it, it's about basically a chef who comes back to a restaurant in Chicago, the death of his brother. He takes over his brother's restaurant. And it really is in some ways about identity, family identity, the identity of the chef. The chef has worked at very kind of well-regarded restaurants, very fancy restaurants, and he comes back to work at the original beef of Chicagoland, right? Which is, basically a working class place where you get a cheap sandwich, right? And so what is the nature of this restaurant, right? The first season is really all about, right, how do you take this fancy chef and kind of integrate him? He's trying to manage his identity both as a chef, right? And he's had kind of a falling out with the whole fancy restaurant, James Beard Award type, milieu. But he's also trying to fit in with his sister and his family and many of the people that he knows. His cousin, who I don't actually think is actually related to him, but they call him a cousin. In some ways, though, the character of Sydney really kind of steals the show, I think, in the first season, because it is not her restaurant, right? But she is a big believer in the chef who has now taken over the restaurant. And she is kind of both learning from him but pushing him, right? Saying, you can do better than this. We can do better than this, right? And she becomes really kind of, I think, integral to the identity of the restaurant, the organizational identity of the restaurant, right? Okay. So, again, the law plays a role here in structuring at will, duty of loyalty, right? Corporate governance, trademark. I'm going to talk more about those. And we've seen conflict over organizational identity, right? A lot of universities have had struggles like, when can the university speak, right? This happened at University of Minnesota very recently. The Board of Trustees said, we don't want any units speaking. It's going to be just one institutional speaking on matters of political importance, right? I'm on the faculty senate. We didn't like that. We had a process for that, for statements. But, this is a conflict, right? And you've seen this with the Disney. There's a huge fight within the company. Originally, the company said, we're not going to really say anything about the what's called the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. But then the employees pushed back, and the company ended up coming out against that bill, right? The Wayfair walkout. A lot of Wayfair employees walked out in protest of the use of Wayfair furniture. This was a number of years ago, I think in maybe 2017, over the use of Wayfair in ICE facilities, right, to house folks who were being processed through deportation. And then Tesla, right? Talk about a change in perception based on one person, right? One person, right? What one person does at that company totally has changed, right? A number of folks now, right, now these are consumers, right? And this is about employment rather than consumer identity. But as consumers, right, you're driving a Tesla. I've seen a lot of people like, oh, I bought this before he was crazy, right? Like people are trying to hey, I know I'm associated with Elon Musk because I have a Tesla, but I don't want that association anymore. I'm trying to help the environment by buying an electronic vehicle association, right? A number of people, right? Some people are buying Teslas now because they want to be associated with Musk, particularly the big cyber trucks, right? All right. Just briefly, I don't want to spend too much more. I don't want to go over my time in such that we run out of time for questions. But I do want to talk about some kind of, again, hot spots here, right? Kim Davis, I don't know how many people remember Kim Davis, but when the Supreme Court said, we're going to move from civil unions, we're going to say marriage cannot be based on sexual orientation, right? We're going to open up marriage to gay and lesbian couples. Kim Davis said, no, I'm not, and she was the clerk of Rowan County. She's like, I'm not going to give the official government imprimatur to those. Right? I'm not going to sign because of my religious conviction. So this was personal religious conviction kind of in conflict with organizational requirements, right? Masterpiece Cake Shop, right? The fight here is a similar law in Colorado saying that you have to serve all customers equally, but basically the baker behind Masterpiece Cake Shop says, I do not want to create wedding cakes for gay and lesbian couples. Supreme Court says he has the right to decide what he exerts his artistic abilities on. His identity overrides their rights to kind of compel a cake from that entity, right? Recent case, Braidwood Management. To what extent can a religious organization be exempt from Title VII when it comes to sexual orientation, right? So can they refuse to hire someone who is LGBTQ, right? So this calls up, I think, big questions about who is the employer, right? When we say, who am I, right? I know who I am in theory. It's a question of like, what is my identity? But like, who is the employer? Like, what actually is the employer, right? That's a little harder question, right? Because it's a fictional entity, right? Who governs the identity of the employer, and what role do employees play in that creation of identity, right? So I go back to theory of the firm. Ronald Coase, this is in his paper, Nature of the Firm, but it's a quote that he uses, right? Why do we have firms at all, right? Why do we have employers, right? Why do we have these organizations? Why not just have everything be contracts on the market, right? But we see that we have, and I just love this terminology, islands of conscious power in this ocean of unconscious cooperation being the invisible hand, right? The market. Like lumps of butter coagulating in a pail of buttermilk, right? Probably not a lot of us see that anymore, but that is like this idea that we have these firms, right? We have these organizations that have their own internal identity outside of the market, right? They're not just a set of market transactions, right? So how are these firms governed? Well, most of it is through business organization, right? And that's something, if you take corporations, right, you talk about maybe a little bit about sole proprietorship, but partnership, LLCs, corporations, and then we have nonprofits, talked about benefit corporations earlier, right? These are all different structures for how these organizations are governed, how they are managed, right? But I want to talk a little bit about the identity of that business, right? Because a business, I think I read somewhere like JP Morgan has like over 100,000 business entities as part of it, right? You can have a lot of different business entities, right? You can create them. You can create them in Delaware or maybe elsewhere. Some people are moving, right? It's a thing that is pretty easy to create, right? But then a business, I think, is different. A business is like an ongoing concern, right? We talk about that in terms of the name of the business, doing business as, the brand, the goodwill associated with the business, right? And what are the relationships between those two things? And then in terms of employment governance, right? We have supervisors and managers are employees, but they're not employees for purposes of labor relations, right? They don't get to organize a union because they represent the employer. Their identity is as the employer and not as employees in a relationship with the employer that labor law creates, right? I just mentioned here briefly the ministerial exception for religious organizations, right? The Supreme Court has said for labor and employment law, we're going to take, or employment law in particular, we're going to take employees out of the protections, those anti-discrimination protections, but if they are ministerial employees that represent the religion, the religious mission of the organization. And of course, unions play a role in governance as well. I want to talk a little bit about trademark because it's something that doesn't often come up in labor and employment, but I think it's important, right? What does a trademark do? It says what the there is, right? It's a way of identifying the source of something, right? And what can change about the source and still keep the trademark? I think trademark has gotten way too easy to keep a trademark and not still be the there, not still be the firm, not still be the thing that earned the trademark, that created the business goodwill, that is reflected in this idea that I can say, I'm going to use this name, right? Now, hopefully this doesn't get, sorry, one more slide before that. So I wrote a brief article, Paradox of Theseus' Ship, right? The paradox is, if Theseus is taking a ship across the Mediterranean and the boards rot, they replace the boards one by one. By the time, after some period of sailing, every board has been replaced in the ship. Is it still the same ship? Right? It's completely different materially. Every board has been replaced, but it still looks the same and people still treat it as Theseus' ship, right? Any WandaVision fans out there? If you watch. So this was a big debate between the two visions that you see in this photo, for those of you who don't know. But like, if you take something and you completely replicate it, is that the same thing or is it a different thing, right? So again, I don't want to make this personal, but right, what is this law school, right? What is it? Is it the people, right? Is it the people working here, right? I would say, yeah, if I'm thinking of the law school, I'm thinking of the people who work here, right? This is just the faculty, right? We have staff, you have all sorts of folks working at the school. Now, right, the law school has been around for a while, and this is the earliest photo I could find of the law school faculty. Obviously, these folks are no longer here, right? The building, you might say, is the law school, right? And I'm going over the law school, right? You're referring to a geographical location, right? But the building can change, right? The fact is, the university could take a different building elsewhere, hire all new people, and say, this is the Maurer School of Law, right? They could do that, right? Now, they're not going to do that, but they could, right? And they could do that in Minnesota, right? Minnesota school law. They could fire us all. Now, again, we'd sue them, but but they could fire us all and create a new law school across the street, or even anywhere else. They could anywhere in the state of Minnesota, pretty much, right? So that, I think, is in some ways like you think, oh well, what is this kind of? It's kind of nihilistic on some level, right? If we, because these are the people. The buildings, what we think of as the place, but they're not really necessary. It's only just a name, a trademark, a legal right to use a name, right? At the same time, I think employees are really important. This is a close to my home. There was a Walgreens employee who was super friendly, super nice. Everybody loved him. He would say hello whenever he came in. And he was so well regarded that Ellen ended up choosing him for a show and kind of celebrating his achievement as a beloved employee, a beloved neighborhood employee, right? That earned a lot of goodwill for Walgreens, right? He was just an employee who worked at the cash register, right? But he had a huge effect on what we think of as Walgreens, particularly locally, right? So trademark gives the power of the identity of the firm to whoever controls the legal entity, right? And I think this is a particular problem with the Fishered workplace, right? When we say, okay, the work of a particular company is being done by folks who are not even employees of that company, right? What happens? Trademark covers all that, right? We're going to apply the trademark to all these workers and say that they're all part of this brand, even though they're not even employees of a particular company, right? So, a couple books that I would recommend in thinking of this move from how do we get employees more involved in control over the trademark by having them more involved in the control over the identity of the company through governance, right? Private Government by Elizabeth Anderson. It's all about why do we hand over power to a small group of people for our work lives. Firm is collaborative community, kind of a different vision. The vision of firm is a group of people collaborating together, right? Let's think about coming up with a workplace constitution, one that allows for employees to participate in the creation of identity, but also does provide protections for those who might disagree, right? Again, going back to that earlier question of personal identity versus group identity, right? If we hand over power to a majoritarian view of employees, I think that would be a lot better, but we would want to protect employees who might be fired because the majority doesn't like them, right? Or might not be hired in the first place, right? So we need that balance. Majoritarian rule with protections for those who find their identities outside the mainstream. I'll talk more about holacracy if people are interested. It's almost like a severance-like idea, although in a positive way, right? It's a different way of conceiving of the corporation. But it's a little Star Trek Next Generation-y, so I'll be happy to talk more about that if people are interested. But basically, the themes of my talk are employment is a critical zone of conflict when it comes to questions of identity, and we have to think about the role the law plays in that and think about ways of making that better so that both personally and organizationally we feel more empowered at our workplaces, right? So not just who is Mark Scout, but also who is Lumen and who gets to control what Lumen does. Right? All right. Thank you very much. All right, I've been told that if you have questions, there's a microphone down here. And I think Professor Dow Schmidt is monitoring online questions, if folks have questions online.
That's right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks again for your terrific presentation. I do have to read the little boilerplate here. For our virtual attendees, they are able to get CLE credit for attending this, and the attendance code is 01150. The code and submission instructions will be sent to you by the chat in Zoom. Please look out for that. And as a reminder, any in-person attendees who want CLE credit, you can sign up outside the door, and the code is really just for people who are online. All right. And so now, if you want to ask a question, please come down and use the microphone, and I'll monitor. I'll look for questions online. So far, your wife and children have not asked any questions. But
I should have planted one. I have a question. Oh, great, thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this talk. I especially liked all the Prestige TV references. I just got done with Severance myself.
Great.
I'm curious about, you talked a lot about this tension in between, like the home self or the work self or employment versus individuality. And I'm wondering if in your research, if you highlight any, specific subordinations of work over, the personal identity. My first thought was, people who are here on work visas, H-1B or H-2A, you're even more at the bidding of your employer than everyone else. I was wondering if, there were any additional ones that you had thought about, written about, seen in your studies.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point. And some of the choices I've made are people who do have a little more power within the workplace, right? Just using the bear as an example, right? He comes into a very bad situation that his brother has left him, but he's in charge, right? I think there are ways in which the employer can subordinate identity and can control, right? Identity such as your ability to be in the country, right? And that is part of this right to control that has led many scholars to say, well, what is an employment relationship? It is a relationship of domination and dependency, right? I agree that in many situations, perhaps most situations, that can be the dominant kind of legal flavor. My hope is that we aspire to something where employment is not an issue of domination based on hierarchy within the corporation or based on laws about who can be in the country and who can't, and the control that the employer plays in that process. Ideally, we move to a situation where people feel more empowered in their work, and there are difficult questions when there's a conflict between personal and organizational identity, but we have ways of working those out that, again, people feel more empowered. But certainly we have to be on the lookout when an employer has too much control over identity, right? There's some cases where the employer, we have laws saying the employer can't tell you how to vote, right? Can't force you to vote for a particular candidate, right? To the extent something like that happens, right? Or and again, part of the big problem when it comes to folks who do not have citizenship protections is even the basic employment rights are often not available, or if they are available, remedies are not available in a way that makes those meaningful. So that's definitely something I think to put into this framework. We do not want the employer to have control over personal identity. Their control over personal identity by way of organizational identity, I think, is a trickier question. And I want people to think about ways in which employees can play more of a role in that organizational identity. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
First of all, thank you for your talk. I also enjoyed all of the television references. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about organizational identity being more attached to a union rather than an employer. Specifically in the entertainment industry, it's such a union town. No one is really emotionally attached to the studio that they're working for, but the identity comes from the artistic creation that is associated by being a part of SAC or being a part of the WGA. So those are instances in which employee identity is incredibly closely tied to the community, but not necessarily tied to the employer.
Right. No, I think that's a second wonderful point. Thanks so much for these questions and comments. I think that industry is an interesting one, right? Because the relationships with studios for actors and writers is not the long-standing relationship, right? And in fact, a lot of times for a movie, there will be a particular production company. Some of these are, long-standing. Sometimes there's a particular entity that's formed for that particular movie. And your relationship is with your union, right? And the union has created structures that allow me to, say, write a screenplay if I'm a writer, and then not worry about, right, getting credit for that and getting residuals for that, or to the extent that I have to worry about it, I have the union on my side, right? I have a whole arbitration structure. Professor Catherine Fisk, who's also a Stewart lecturer as well recently, has written some amazing work talking about this structure that the WGA has created that allows writers to feel like I am participating in this ongoing enterprise, and I'm going to get residuals, right? That's the power, right? I kind of want data residuals for workers who contribute to an algorithm, right? And that's something that Professor Afoma Ajenwa has written about recently in the Yale Law Journal, a terrific piece that I'm really excited about. I think, and just to mention yet another person, right? Sanjukta Paul has talked about how we kind of privilege firms, particularly with regard to antitrust immunity, and maybe we should have other intermediate structures. I think unions, particularly when the employment relationship is not as stable, unions become really important. Now, an interesting question, and again, this is something that I was reflecting on, I probably should have spent more time on. The role, the relationship within a stable employment relationship, right? So you work for GM, right? What is your relationship with GM versus your relationship with the UAW, right? I think that's a really interesting question. And that's one reason why a lot of employers don't like unions, is because they feel like that separates the identification that a worker might have with the employer. Like, oh, I'm more attached to my union, right? I'm more attached to this group of people working nationally, right? I think it's a really interesting question. And in another paper I wrote about how we have to improve people's professional and occupational identities, right? So the ABA, so the UAW in a sense, but associations of people who do a particular type of job. We need to strengthen that as an identity fixture, not just for professional organizations, but across the board, right? Any type of job, there should be identification of doing well at that particular craft. So I think that's a terrific point. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, Professor Bodie. So one thing I was curious about was, because obviously the talks are all about, broad questions of identity, but I know something you've talked about and a lot of corporate law scholars have talked about is the primacy of shareholders and profit maximization for shareholders has obviously created an environment where I think the constituency most businesses think about is them as opposed to the employees, the people they serve, right? And so if we're thinking about the dynamic of how can employees find their identity under an employer, if the employers seem to be thinking more and more about the shareholders and less about the employees, what are the ways, I'm curious, that you think that employees can then sort of, while working with the firm, go it on their own, so to speak, within the system to form their identity? Or if we were to change that framework, what are the ways that might change how employees need to think about forming their identity within a firm?
Right. That's, again, a really great point. I think things shifted, right? In the 80s, I think most boards thought that they were representing the organization as a whole, and that focused on employees, right? And then over time, this idea of shareholder primacy kind of infused itself in the culture, particularly in the business management culture. And so I do think a lot of times the board members and the CEO think of themselves as working for the shareholders, directed toward the shareholders, right? And some circumstances, right, you saw in the Hobby Lobby case, right, it's the shareholders who control the religious identity of the corporation, right? Because there's a small group of family shareholders and they all share the same religion, right? The Supreme Court said under those circumstances, we might say that a corporation does have a religious identity. I think we need to bring workers back into the equation, right? One way would be through something like co-determination, where employees have a vote for who's on the board, right? Some percentage of folks on the board. This has been proposed by a number of senators here, but I'm always happy to talk about that and put that into the conversation. But I think even within the context now, right, I think it's something where employees do have to push for that more. And if you read like the Harvard Business Review, half the articles are like, how can we get our employees to get more invested in the company, right? They care about employees. They care about keeping talent. They care about motivating people. I have a book of successories that my wife got me. I don't know if people know those, right? It's like all the people rowing together. You put those up on the wall. Like, if we all row together, we'll do a lot better, that kind of thing. Like this idea that like, management wants you to think you're part of the family, right? And again, we've gotten very cynical about that, and I think justifiably so. But there is something to that. We do want to be part of a larger whole. We do want to feel like we're working with other people to make the world a better place. And so I think that's something that employees can try to do. Unionization is another way of getting that collective power. And certainly I think that sort of identitarian move is a good one. And I think you've seen that at Starbucks Workers United, among other places recently. Oh, one more question, I think we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
I'll try to make it quick then.
If folks have to leave for class, of course.
Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned moving towards a more majoritarian system with protections for minority interests. In a matter of identity, though, if we're asking for employee input, does that risk, especially in larger institutions, incentivizing employees in different sections, departments, divisions to subordinate their own material interests towards these other more identity-focused, say, guys in sales versus on the line versus management? How would those interact, the material versus the identity?
Right. There's always a sense that, right, the employer's trying to make you feel like part of the family until, of course, right, it's time to open your paycheck, and then, suddenly you're not really part of the family, right? Or there's time for layoffs, right? And that's one thing, if you look at the statistics, surprisingly, workers in German companies that do have co-determination aren't paid as high as U.S. workers on some level, but they have much better job security. And particularly during the 2008 financial crisis, German firms sacrificed jobs for wages in a way that U.S. workers were not willing to do because they couldn't trust that the company would uphold the later end of the bargain. So I do think there is that worry about false consciousness about being taken advantage of. But at the same time, it is playing into something that I think is natural and human, and that we do want to feel part of a larger whole. We do want to feel like we're working with a group that is, again, doing good things. And I'm going to start to sound really Pollyannish. So I think I'll stop there. And thank you for your question. And thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.